Here's Jacob. Jacob was following God's will, walking in God's will, but now he just, at some point in that journey, just decides, you know what, I'm just going to stop doing this. I'm going to settle right here. I'm just going to build a house, build some barns, and I'm just going to stay here. You know, you can walk faithfully with the Lord and then just suddenly settle for something that's not His will. I'm just going to settle here. I'm not going to finish. I'm not going to keep going. I'm just going to settle it right here. And God will allow us to do that. God will allow us to settle outside of His will for us. And as long as we are living outside of God's will, we're missing what God has for us in His will. The promises were in Canaan. They're not in this town of Sukkot. He's missing out on God's plan for him. So he stays there, though. He stays there in Sukkot for some time, long enough to build a house and barns. He settles down there for a period of time in his life. By the way, lost years, right? You know, these years where he's just outside of God's will, doing his own thing. But then at some point, he leaves and he finally goes into Canaan. So his stop in Sukkot delayed himself from entering into the promised land. And it's just lost time. Lost time outside of the Lord's will. Man, we don't want to settle. We don't want to compromise in any way that delays us from walking in what God has for us. We don't want to settle and compromise in a way where we just are losing time because we're not in God's will. We don't want a Sukkot in our lives. We don't want to delay our obedience to the Lord. And so finally, though, verse 18, then Jacob came, notice, safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan. Hip, hip, hooray. When he came from Padanaram and he pitched his tent before the city, or just on the outskirts of the city, because he's an outsider, he's not from that town. And so he would live on the outskirts of the city. So he's finally back in the land of Canaan, and he arrives in the land of Canaan safely, just as God promised him that He would bring him back to the land of Canaan safely, and God has been faithful to bring him. But notice he leaves behind a house in Sukkot, and when he enters into the land of Canaan, he moves back into a tent. Jacob would rather live in a tent in God's will than in a house outside of God's will, right? I'd rather be in the Lord's will than outside of His will. No matter how good I have it outside of His will, I'd rather be in His will every time. And so, look what it says, verse 19. And this is wonderful. And he bought the parcel of land just outside of Shechem, where he had pitched his tent, from the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. Then he erected an altar there and called it Elelohe-Israel. This is his new name, Israel, that he received in chapter 33 or 32, right? So he uses the new name for the first time here. But what's important for you to note is that Jacob buys this little plot of land on the outskirts of the city of Shechem. And this is significant because other than the cave of Machpelah that Abraham purchased to bury his wife Sarah, a tomb, this is the first parcel of land that Israel owns in the Promised Land. This little property in Shechem. You know, God has promised to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants all of the land, but this is where it begins, really. There's the cave at Machpelah, but you can't live in a cave. But here, it's the first piece of the Promised Land owned by the Israelites. And because it's the first parcel of the Promised Land that they owned, it becomes important in Israel's history. You keep seeing Shechem come up throughout their history, both Old Testament and New Testament. Jacob will dig a well on his property there in Shechem. And in the Gospel of John, we have a very wonderful conversation that takes place between Jesus and a woman at that well. And I want to look at that as we finish up today. So if you want to turn over to John chapter 4. Now, on our last trip to Israel, we went to Shechem. And we went to the city of Shechem. We went to Jacob's well there. Very few, if any, tourists go to Shechem anymore. Even though it's very significant in Israel's history. This is their first piece of property that they own. No one really goes there anymore. But we went there. Our group went there. One of the things that I remember the most is just how intense Jeff Peterson was. Is Jeff in here? How intense Jeff Peterson was while we were in Shechem, because it seemed kind of dangerous being there. It seemed a little unsafe. It was a little unsettling maybe, but we had the whole place to ourselves. It was so dangerous no other tourists would go there, but we went there. John chapter 4. It says in verse 1, "Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself did not baptize, but his disciples did, he left Judea." So he's down in Jerusalem. He leaves Judea and departed again to Galilee, which is in the north. And he needed to go through Samaria. Now, sometimes in commentaries or in sermons, maybe even some footnotes in your Bible, you may hear that the Jewish people typically never traveled through Samaria because they disliked the Samaritans so much, and they say that so they would go around Samaria, and they'd cross the Jordan River and go up and around, and then cross back over the Jordan River, and they would bypass Samaria. Has anybody ever heard that kind of thing before? A couple of you maybe? Yeah. That's not true at all. They would go through Samaria. There's other passages in the Gospels where Jesus is going through Samaria. There's other extra-biblical records that we have of the Jews traveling through Samaria to and from Jerusalem. So this isn't something out of the ordinary for Jesus to go through Samaria. And he came to a city of Samaria, verse 5, which is called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. That's the plot of ground we're talking about back in Genesis chapter 33. Joseph today is buried on that plot of ground. When the children of Israel come back, when they come out of Egypt in the Exodus story, they bring the bones of Joseph with them from Egypt, and they bury Joseph in Shechem, on the plot of ground that Jacob had purchased back in Genesis 33.